That wasn't a good whistle. You don't want to hear the shrill one. Good evening, everyone. Wow, what a nice turnout tonight. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us. We're delighted to have you here. We really are. I'm Stan Morse, the current president of the society. These things change on a regular basis, and I'm just the person spot holding right now. So welcome to our September meeting of 2015. By my count, this means the 6th regular meeting of the year, because we have meetings from January to May. We hold our annual tea in June. We take the summer off because of summer conflicts and vacations and schools, so forth. We bring it back for 3 months in September, October, and November. Then we take the holiday month of December and say, enjoy. So we have 8 meetings a year plus an annual tea. This is our September meeting. Welcome. Delighted to have you with us. We're going to keep our announcements short because we have a very complex program. Probably the most complex program as far as number of segments and what we intend to do that we've had here since I've been president. I'd like to start off with something in the way of a memorial statement. Early on in the summertime, Millbrook lost one of its finest citizens, certainly one of its finest business people, a friend of mine, a friend of most everybody in this room who knew him, Scott Meyer. Passed away after a long, long struggle. Operations, discomfort, agony for his family, Allison, and the boys. Scott lost his battle in early summer. A wonderful, beautiful tribute and memorial service was held at the Millbrook School. Allison, what was the date? Do you remember what that was?
The memorial? It was on the 2nd.
It was the 2nd. Okay, very good. Thank you. And Scott's not going to be with us tonight, unfortunately. But in his memory, we would like to dedicate, by unanimous vote of the board tonight, the remainder of the programs for September, October, and November of 2015 to Scott's memory. I think it's only appropriate. It's the right thing to do. And we miss Scott very, very much. Okay, our program for tonight. The most complex we've had in a long while. We're going to start off by a very brief review by a guest speaker that was put on the agenda only a couple, 3 weeks ago. And I'll introduce her in just a moment. She's the new director of our library here at Millbrook. So I think she has an important message for you. Our main presentation on Innisfree will have 4 parts. David Greenwood will kick it off. Lee Cornell has stepped into the breach due to a very unexpected absence of Kate Kerin, the director of Innisfree. I know that you perhaps anticipated meeting Kate and hearing from her tonight, but Kate did realize on Monday she just could not be here. She put her head together. She put her head together with Lee Cornell, and Lee has pulled off a really magnificent PowerPoint presentation of about 20 minutes length for you, talking about the design. And I don't even know, I haven't even seen the presentation, but I know it's going to be good. Lee will be followed by me, relating some stories about Edie McDonald, who was raised in Innisfree. Some insider stories, some dirt, some fun, you know, that type of thing. That's not dirt. There's no dirt related to Innisfree. It was great. And then Jim Cornell, Lee's spouse, will finish out the program telling us the future, the anticipations, the dreams of Innisfree for the future. Jim is a recent trustee. Appointment to the Innisfree board. After that's done, we have a bonus for you. And after Jim finishes speaking, we'll tell you about the bonus. I count just a little bit under 80 people here tonight. Wonderful. The bonus will proceed. After that, we're going to invite you as a group or individually to be escorted, and we'll make it orderly, please, and everything. It'll be fun. We want you to go in through the corridor to another room in the church. We're in the church's social room. 3 very prominent pastel paintings hang on the wall, which I will talk about during my presentation. More about that later on. And then you're invited back for some wonderful refreshments They've been organized by Nancy Greer and Henry Katie. So we're having a good program. Let's not play around with any more time. Stephanie Harrison, come on up here. Stephanie is the director of the library, the new director. She's been there about a year. Her home is Hopewell Junction, is it?
It is.
Hopewell Junction. Stephanie, why don't you give us your message?
All right, well, thank you for letting me come. Stan gave me like 3 minutes to talk, so I'm going to talk really fast. So who has a library card here? A lot of you? Yay! Who doesn't have a library card? Well, that's great that you don't, because September is library card sign-up month, and that's why I'm here. I just want to talk about the importance of a library card. The library is right down the street. I've seen a lot of you in the library, yay, but I'd like to see a lot more. Come in and get a library card this month if you don't have one. If you lost your card, you can get a free replacement card. Normally they're $3. And we now have Millbrook cards. They used to be just plain Mid-Hudson cards. Now we have Millbrook cards with a keychain card that you can put on your keychain. You'll never lose it. If you have accumulated some fines, we're doing a fun fundraiser for the Dutchess County SPCA where you can bring in items and get money taken off of your fines. So I encourage you to do that as well. And we're not just about books. As you probably know, we do some great programs nowadays. Last night we just had a Moroccan cooking demonstration. Next week we are having a lotus flower craft with some Korean food. In the spring, we're going to be collaborating with the Historical Society and with Innisfree to hopefully put on a Japanese arts and culture program series. So, you know, we're working not just for us, but with all the organizations in Millbrook to provide the community with a lot of great things. So I encourage you to stop in. And finally, I just wanted to mention, you might have heard about our 414 vote that will be coming up in November on Election Day. If you want to know more about that, why we're asking for the money, what we're going to do with it if it passes, what will happen if it fails, I encourage you to come in the library. We do have these 414 frequently asked question cards you can grab. You can come talk to me, ask any questions that you might have about it. Or you can just come in and talk to me about anything that you'd like to see at the library. I am coming up. My door is always open, and I would like to see you all there. So I think I stayed under 3 minutes. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was short, sweet, and right to the point. So I tell you, if you are not a user of our library, I encourage you to go. It's a wonderful setting. It's comfortable. It's cool. The staff there is extremely helpful, and they've got a great source and the tie into the Mid-Hudson Library System. So thank you, Stephanie.
All right, thank you guys very much.
Let's get ready to the presentation. David Greenwood.
And Stephanie, before you go, it's a plug. I just want to show everyone that I have a card. So this is exactly what you'll be getting, the new version of it.
Absolutely.
The library is an extraordinary resource. So thank you again for that.
Yes, thank you, Dave.
A couple of things, and that is, so often we take for granted things that we see every day, and we think we know all the details for it, but something may come up that suddenly causes you to stop and see things in a new light. And I'm sure that's happened to all of you. Question, are any of you Turrell family descendants in the room? No? Because while we were working on the project a few weeks ago, a descendant came with photographs and images about the Turrell family. Do you know anything about the Turrell family? Okay. Well, the Turrell family, the Turrell that created the park area that ultimately becomes Innisfree, was born in Troy, New York. Now that may not mean anything to anyone. Why was he down here looking for property in the 1870s, 1860s? Because so many of our families were living in Troy. The mayor of Troy happened to be Richard Hart. Anyone know that name? Hart's Village? He was down here because of the family connections from up there. So why was he here? He was a printer in New York City and had a very successful company. You'll hear more about that in a minute, but I'm getting ahead of myself. A newspaper. This happens to be Greater New York, and it's published in New Jersey. It's an extension of the Wall Street Journal. And in it, on the front page, on the bottom, 2 historic New Jersey properties, 2 preservation battles. And it's specifically about 2 families. One of them, northern New Jersey, Mendham Township, and a group is fighting to preserve the Pitney Farm. Now, a name you wouldn't know. But the Pitney Farm happens to be 11 generations of a farm family in that part of New Jersey. And in 2013, the town bought the farm from the last descendant, thinking that they'd make the main house into their new town hall. And the decision was made, no, 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 too much money, let's tear the house down. Does that sound like something we've heard? And people in the area say, no, 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 the house is so important, you've got to save it, got to save it. The second one, very much the same kind of battle, happens to be Doris Duke. You know that name? Okay. The Duke Farm in New Jersey, same thing. Over 2,000 acres of gardens, protected areas, walkways, incredible. And the people who are responsible for that Duke Farm want to tear the main house down. That's 67 rooms, okay? And people were horrified, but that's the Doris Duke house, and it's historic. In point of fact, the core of that was a very modest little farmhouse that Doris Duke's father bought and expanded, 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 expanded to maintain the house, to stabilize the house. Now, today, is going to cost over $20 million. For a house that has no historic value, taking up what is essentially a garden and walk area. Does that sound familiar? It should, because of what happened at Innisfree. So here's something happening as we speak about juggling what is important, what isn't, what should be preserved, what shouldn't, where is the priority going to be. Okay, that is setting the stage. What was the area originally that we're talking about? And the true academic in me, I take notes and keep them, and eventually these will be in the archives as well. So let me read this. Benjamin Harvey Turrell, and that's the way the family pronounced the name, Turrell, 1839-1908, visited Bullis Pond. How many of you know that name? Bullis Pond. And decided that he wanted to assemble parcels around that pond and create a hall, basically a destination. And he did. 8 major parcels that ultimately became what we think of today as Innisfree. Now, this is an interesting element of it. He named it Turrell Lake. Why? That's his family name with 1 L. Now, what was his job when he wasn't up here in the summer working on this and organizing it? A printer in New York, stationery and others. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, you won't recognize it, but this happens to be one of 3 postcards of Turrell Lake and of what is called the Lake House. Not the pavilion, the Lake House. This was the house that he built on the lake to entertain, to invite people for parties and destinations and so on, to celebrate the lake. He also had, depending on the year, as many as 40 boats on that lake that you could take and pedal around and enjoy the countryside. Now, why is this important? Because it was published in 1898. Now, what does that mean? Well, 1898 is the first year that postcards are allowed to be mailed. Did you know that? 1898. The law in 1898 with a postcard, with a picture, is the flip side could only have the mailing address. You couldn't write on it. So you've got a picture, and if you wanted to write anything at all, you'd have to write it over the picture, because the other side could only be the address. 3 views were created with these postcards, 1898. One shows the main house, the other is the upper pond, lower pond. So they're areas that we've seen, we've got them in the archive. Now why is it so important? Because today I'm looking at the detail of it, and it happens to be Lake House, East Shore, Upper Lake, Terrell Print, 205 Fulton Street, New York. Who published them? He did! He did. Now, the next one happens to be in 1908. And here it is. Postcard. Some of you may have it, 1908. Now, what happens between 1898 and 1908? In 1908, the government says, hey, you can write on the back. And it's divided. So you put the address on one side and you can write your message on the other. Isn't that interesting? But now you look at it, and it's entrance to Terrell Lake, Millbrook, New York, with the 2 L's. So the earlier one, Terrell. The later one, 1908, Terrell. Then you look at it, oh, Sheldon's Pharmacy is publishing it. Oh, Allen's Pharmacy is publishing it. That's when the name shifted from Terrell, the family name, to Terrell. Now, that reminds me of something we all know about. If you drive down the road through the next hamlet, Mabbittsville, have you noticed the different ways Mabbittsville is spelled on those official signs? It's all over the place. The same thing happened back in 1908. Now, here's the important thing, and this is where I'm going. The original Mr. Terrell dies, and his son takes over. Guess what year he dies? 1908. Okay? With that, the postcards are being published by the other 2 sources in the area. Now, time moves on. And the last postcard that we have, and this is Sheldon's now, another pharmacy, happens to be in color. Okay? It's in color. And it happens to be 1917. 1917. And it has Lakeview, Terrell Lake, Millbrook, New York. Sheldon's Pharmacy is on it. Now, why is that important? Because in 1917, it's still Terrell Lake, and the house is still standing. It's still being used as a destination. Why is this important? Why do we know the date on it? Because this is the year that postcards end up having white borders. You follow? We take that for granted now. 3 postcards track the evolution of that property from the earliest one, the Terrell family, to Terrell, 1917. Now, if you look at resources on finding out information about the estate, you go to Louise Tompkins, and she put a lot of things together, and that's wonderful. And in her article that she published, she says that the future Mrs. Beck buys the property in 1916. Guess what? Her father buys the property in, can you guess a year? 1917, the end of 1917. But he buys the property. Did you realize that, Jim?
No.
He bought the property. When he kicks the bucket in 1919, guess who inherits the property? His daughter. And in 1922, when she marries her husband, Beck, it becomes what we think of now as Innisfree. All these bits and pieces help to set the stage for what's going to happen on that parcel. But here is another element, and it may come up in conversation or it may not. Everyone knows of Mrs. Beck as being extraordinarily wealthy. Yes? Have you heard that? It's not true. She and her father and brothers and sisters ended up having an extraordinary conflict. And when her father dies in 1919, his will stipulates that his estate, over $100 million will go to descendants if they're still alive, 21 years after the youngest grandchild dies. Guess when that was? 2010. Now, you look at, well, what did she get? What was her estate? Where was the wealth? It turns out when the father's will was probated, she received $1,000 annually from her father's estate. The main house servant gets $3,000 annually. Does that tell you something? 1920, what happens? 1920, in Wisconsin, there is a fluke in the Constitution of that says no will can have that arbitrary a dispersal amount. So what happens, the state settles on it. And the estate ends up allocating $5 million to the 7 current survivors. So Mrs. Beck received that share, but it's an annuity based on $5 million, along with her sisters and brothers. You follow? So she is getting $1,000 a year from her father proper, and then a percentage off the top of that $5 million. But the stipulation there is when she dies, it reverts back to the main trust. So the amount of money that she has that she's working with is marginal. It's a lot of money, would be certainly for us, but to support the estate and so on, it isn't nearly as much as we would have thought. That's part of an intrigue. Now, having said that, the next phase. Mrs. Beck and her husband come in. She's inherited the property from her father. And she's married in 1922. And they start deciding what they're going to be doing with the property itself. And with that, Lee, it's all yours.
Fascinating, and of course it's always a hard act to follow, David Greenwood. This is truly the 21st century. Instead of Kate Kerin being here, she's kind of going to be here through this video presentation. And maybe in a decade or so from now, she'll be a hologram here giving you that same presentation. But I'm here right now to introduce you to Kate Kerin. Kate Kerin is a native of Dutchess County. She went to Wellesley and obtained her degree, a BA in architecture, and then she went to Cornell University and got a degree in a master's in landscape architecture. She's alternated between working in private practice and doing different garden designs. And one of those designs includes a garden in Rhinebeck where Chelsea Clinton was married. And she also does a lot of work for not-for-profits, and one of those is the Garden Conservancy, which is located in Garrison, New York. She's also spent a year as an intern learning practical horticulture at Stonecrop Garden, which is in Garrison, New York. She's published widely. She wrote a series of articles for a British garden journal called Horticus, and she's also given presentations to the Morgan Library when they were doing a big exhibit, and their theme was romantic gardens. So that's just a little taste of Kate Kerin. And she wishes she were here. I'm not the next best thing. This is going to be the next best thing. So I've got my fingers crossed that technology will cooperate. So far, so good.
Like the pyramids of Egypt or the Great Wall of China, Innisfree helps us to define what we mean by civilization. It is one of the few places in this world that has lived up to, nay, exceeded my expectations. Innisfree is one of the world's 10 best gardens. What is Innisfree? I drive by that sign all the time. Hi, I'm Kate Kerin, curator at Innisfree Garden, and this evening I'd like to invite you past the sign and out into the landscape. Innisfree began its life as the private estate of Walter and Marion Beck. Walter, a painter, Marion, a gardener, and fortunately, an heiress. They were married in 1922, and they spent a considerable amount of time thinking about what their estate in Millbrook should be like. They interviewed the French modernist Le Corbusier, that's one of his buildings on the top, the Villa Savoy, and they ended up building a copy of the Queen Anne-style house at the Royal Horticultural Society's garden at Wisley. Something of an about-face. Here's a view of the Beck's house from the back. When it was completed in 1930, there's a story of Walter taking Marion by the hand out onto their front step and saying, "Darling, this approach is all wrong for our site." She must have had a good sense of humor because she said, "Great, let's take a study tour to Europe." There, they discovered at the British Museum of all places, a scroll painting of an 8th century Chinese garden created by the poet and painter Wang Wei. What they saw in Wang Wei's garden was a landscape very like their own, very like the glacially formed landscape surrounding Tyrrell Lake. Steep wooded slopes coming down to water's edge, dotted with rock outcroppings. There were also clearly defined gardens set, in effect, into wilderness. Beck called these cup gardens. Working with this concept, Walter and Marion could garden at Innisfree, but garden in the spirit of place, in the spirit of the landscape that had originally brought them to Millbrook. Woods and rocks melding together seamlessly with some simple and some more complex designs. A cup garden could be massive. It could be the entirety of Innisfree, a natural bowl wrapping around the lake. Or it could be minute, a single rock covered in moss and lichen, tucked into the roots of a tree. These Chinese inspirations became deeply important to the Becks. They started collecting Chinese art, studying texts on Chinese gardens, and in fact in 1938, they hosted a series of lectures on Chinese gardens at Harvard. There, they met a young man, still an undergraduate at Harvard, named Lester Collins. He began to work for them at Innisfree that very year. In 1939 and 40, he traveled throughout Asia, mostly China, but not exclusively, studying gardens. When he came back, he obtained his master's degree in landscape architecture from Harvard. He then went on to become a professor at Harvard and the dean of the Department of Landscape Architecture, a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects, with a client list that included the likes of Paul Tudor Jones and the Graham family of Washington, D.C. and the state of Florida. Not bad for what I imagine to be the punk kid chatting up the patrons at the cocktail party after a lecture at college. Lester Collins was in fact a modernist. When he was at Harvard, it was the moment that modernism hit the American design scene. But his other designs, his other commissions, are really quite famous. They include a tremendous amount of work for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, including the Enid Haupt Garden, which is what is in front of the Renwick Castle, that sort of Gothic brick castle. Lots of work at the National Zoo, including the Panda Diplomacy exhibit. He also did the Hirshhorn Sculpture Garden. And I think looking at some of these photographs with images of Innisfree, I begin to see how he placed objects in the landscape and made us feel like it was one composition, but this very fluid, beautiful, almost cinematic kind of experience. Innisfree imagery. This wonderful juxtaposition, just like the Hirshhorn, of sort of very rectilinear geometric forms and more naturalistic shapes. Lester showed us he was a modernist in the very choice of chairs that he designed for the garden when it opened. The Innisfree chairs are actually a simplification of one of the most famous modernist chairs of all time. In fact, the Museum of Modern Art's design store uses this, Gerrit Rietveld's red-blue chair, as its icon. Lester made it in natural wood. It's simple, comfortable, inexpensive, and easy to move around. It's so great that Wave Hill and the Bronx copied it. They used to say, "Thank you, Lester Collins, thank you, Innisfree Garden." They changed the angle on the back a little, and now they've made a small fortune, but we copied too. Anyway, so Lester was showing us he was a modernist, even by asking us to take a seat. He writes about Innisfree in a book called Innisfree, An American Garden, which was published just after his death. He died in '93. The book was released in 1994. He writes, "Western gardens are usually designed to embrace a view of the whole. Little is hidden. The garden, like a stage set, is there in its entirety, its overall design revealed in a glance. The traditional Chinese garden is usually designed so that a view of the whole is impossible. It requires a stroll over serpentine, seemingly aimless arteries. The observer walks into a series of episodes, like Alice through the looking glass." I guess I do feel a bit like that, walking around the lake at Innisfree. Like the great Chinese masters of the landscape, Collins listened to the garden itself when making his improvements. Here you can see Dumpling Knoll, a glacial drumlin on the right, and that sort of beautiful curve reflected quite literally in an oxbow in the stream, something Lester called the Yaramizu. In 1953 and 1954, Lester moved with his family to Japan as a Fulbright scholar. There he studied Japanese garden design and, interestingly, traditional garden construction techniques. He also worked with scholars there to translate what is thought to be one of the most important Japanese garden books, something he called the Sensai Hisho, the secret garden book. More contemporary translations now call it the Sakuteke, the art of setting stones. This is a very famous gravel garden, Ryoanji, in Kyoto. Here's a detail. And here's Innisfree. Here's one of the imperial gardens in Japan. And here is Innisfree. The Becks had a beautiful idea for their garden after their deaths. As they had no children, they wanted the place to be open to the public and to become a study center. To that end, they set up the nonprofit Innisfree Foundation and asked Lester Collins to become the president. Unfortunately, when Marion died, all the money was gone. Instead of a $1 million endowment, Innisfree Foundation had to come up with $200,000 in cash to settle Mrs. Beck's debts and her personal bequests. In fact, the estate's attorney didn't feel it was possible. He thought everything would need to be sold, and if there was anything left over, it could be given away in scholarships to landscape architects. Lester Collins loved the idea as much as the Becks did, and as a thrifty Quaker, with sort of centuries of farmers and horticulturists and innovators in his family, he decided to press on. But what that meant was a lot of the ideas of the garden, the very detailed plantings, the moss garden that had 2 full-time gardeners that was so delicate that Bex could only visit once a week, the huge cutting garden, the white garden, things like this could certainly not be maintained on a tight budget. The staff, the very large staff, dropped by, let's see, probably 80% overnight. And for many, many decades, I feel we're sort of still there, Innisfree got by with extreme, sort of thrift and fiscal conservatism. But over the decades that Lester continued to work on the garden, he more than doubled the size of it. He had this idea that Innisfree had to both sustain and survive public interest. So he made it wrap all the way around the lake, something that it didn't do in Beck's lifetime. And he started to innovate, creating today what are very timely ways of working with the landscape, working with the ecologies, the different ecosystems on different parts of the site, really working in concert with nature to create design effects that were not terrifically expensive. The genius of this place lies not so much in the ideas which the designers formulated for the cup gardens, many of which are disarmingly simple, but in the way they have been maintained over the years. Essentially, everything is allowed to settle into the prevailing spirit of the place. If it does not, it is removed. It is this sensitivity, care, and attention to the qualities of landscape, natural and made, that make Innisfree such a memorable success. So what we see at Innisfree is a way of creating today a 185-acre public garden that has a certain sense of brightness about it, but a lot of it is because the plants sort of move around on their own. Lester was able to work on design areas over many years, adjusting grading, changing structures just a bit, moving trees, moving rocks. So you get incredible effects like this. There's another view of the Aramizu. And this view, the long view, down towards the lower portion of Tyrrell Lake, our beautiful Japanese primroses which bloom in late May. So to get a sense of the garden, let's take a quick tour together. This is where one might start, in the picnic area, looking out across Tyrrell Lake, this to the southwest. Going round the lake counterclockwise, you'll first come to the Mist, a feature Lester designed in the 80s, and it's set into the East Rock Garden. Here's a detail of that. When the morning light catches the mist just right, it's full of rainbows. Here's the Lip Rock waterfall. This is typical of the sort of feature that Walter Beck and Lester Collins designed together. Here, however, you can see some of the plantings that we discussed were the sort of lower budget plantings, which I think make this so exceptional. We have native columbine and Japanese primroses that have self-seeded in and around the rocks, beautiful moss, lichens, ferns. So it feels somehow, even though this is a near perfect composition, that it's something, going back to One Way, that you would just discover on a hike in the forest. Here you get your first view of the water sculpture, which is actually the last thing Lester designed at Innisfree. It's up on the terrace where the house used to be, but Lester uses this as a design motif that catches your attention at different moments and pulls you forward through the garden. This is the meadow. In the Beck's lifetime, this was still called the meadow, but it was mostly full of trees. There was a clearing, but there were trees all along the lake and trees sort of all to the far right. So it was a much smaller meadow, a very different understanding, very different sort of sense of space. Today, you feel these very sculptural landforms more clearly because they were revealed. This is all work that Lester did after the Beck's death. The Yaramizu. This stream was a section of the garden that Lester designed after coming home from Japan. After Walter Beck's death, he and Marion started talking about this section, which was then mostly wooded. There had been a stream running through here, but when the Becks built their house and built a reservoir to supply it with water, they dammed up the little valley that kind of collected the water for the stream. So all they got was storm surge. So imagine this as woods with something of an eroded stream coming through the middle. Lester said, in Japan, they do so much sort of these wonderful, narrow, stylized streams. I think you could make something kind of fun here. So literally setting out hundreds of feet of hose, they hand dug, they laid out the curves of the stream, they hand dug it, they set rocks in it, they planted things, and over many decades, they've naturalized until we get something like this. Here, early on, you see the ferns just coming along, the primroses blooming. It's really quite special. Later in the season, this same space changes character entirely. Here we are looking at it again when the Joe Pye weed, a wonderful and tall native, these can be 5 and 6 feet tall, comes into bloom. This is pollinator heaven. A little bit further down in this new stream that Lester created, he built a traditional Japanese-style bridge, the zigzag bridge. The idea was that as you walked one way and the bridge changed, it forced you to basically look around you, to change your perspective, to take your environment in. As you move up, you come to these fantastic terraces. The Becks wanted a particular view. They wanted this long view down the lower part of Tyrrell Lake. So they had to construct these elaborate terraces on a steep hillside to create flat space for their home. When the money ran out and Lester had to sort of keep all this going as a public garden, he turned to very bold planting effects. I think they were really the only things that could stand up to this wonderful, crazy, and sort of full of personality rock work that Walter Beck had created and loved so much. But here you see vertical plants, horizontal plants, different colors of leaves. There was a white garden, there was a huge cutting garden. This area was simplified so much and is really quite low maintenance, but all done really innovatively. It, I think, becomes sort of the most intensely designed core of the garden, and everything else, those sort of soothing greens you see in the distance, radiate out from there. This is Walter Beck's grotto. He imagined these stones as animals, and he saw them sort of locked in battle in this beautiful form. And then over time, these fantastic climbing hydrangeas have sort of grown around to emphasize that beautiful circular shape. Here's a pool. Later will be filled with lotus, but this is an early spring view. This was created by the Becks. They planted the lotus here. There's a great story of them putting the lotus tubers in and filling the pool in with sheep manure. Believe me, they're pure white and gorgeous every year. But this was in the center of Marion's cutting garden. So it was pretty much covered up by these tall annuals that she used throughout the house in vases. So some things kind of came into their own when other planting details could no longer be maintained. This is the water sculpture. We caught a glimpse of it before. This was the last thing Lester designed at Innisfree, and it was on the site of the Beck's house. In 1959, the house cost $6,000 for 1 month of heat. Needless to say, Innisfree Foundation, broke as it was, and sort of has always been, could never afford to heat the house again. By 1980, because of freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing over all those years, the foundation was in terrible shape The house, which had been completed in 1930, needed many other major updates, and Innisfree simply couldn't afford it. The house was taken down in the winter when the ground is hard, the heavy machinery wouldn't cause so much damage, and when the public wasn't there, because a demolition site is very dangerous. Afterwards, it took a long time to figure out what to do with that space, but this towering sort of water sculpture with this billowing cloud of water is a perennial favorite. Believe me, I've seen children of all ages, including seniors with walkers, playing in this water. This is what the Becks considered their front lawn, the view down to the lake with this glorious white oak. Lester propped some of the more horizontal branches up, Japanese fashion, with bits of wood so that they wouldn't break off in storms. Sort of loving that wild, aged character of those crazy branches. Here's a wider view, early spring, early morning, this terrific sweep of grass down towards the point. This is the Stone Mountain, a wonderful cup garden that Walter designed, just the sort of thing he loved, this crazy construct, an arch of gigantic stones. And here are naturalized Japanese primroses filling in and making everything feel like it's been there forever. This is the point, perhaps one of the most imageable portions of Innisfree. This was one of the first parts of the garden that was created. So if you think back to the very traditional Queen Anne style house that the Becks built, and then you look at this as the landscape, there's Turtle Rock on the left, Dragon Rock in the center, and Owl Rock on the right. You might be able to understand why Walter and Marion decided that the house was not sympathetic to the landscape approach that interested them. Here's a view from the point back up towards where the house would have been. Our famous hardy lotus will have 1 or 2 blooms at a time, sometimes well into October, but this was a peak moment, truly fantastic. This is looking down the channel between the main part of Tyrrell Lake, where Innisfree sits, and the lower part. This was the view the Becks loved so much. Now we're coming up into the pine woods, the pine island we call it. Lester cleared away the understory and limbed up the pines to really accentuate this incredible verticality. It feels really like a cathedral. The wonderful effect, I'd like to say he was smart enough to know it was going to happen, I'm just not totally sure, was that the native seed bed of all kinds of wonderful wildflowers was activated when they got more light. So we have a tremendous array of rare native plants, including luscious items like pink lady slipper orchids. Here's another view of back of the lake from Pine Island. And here is a fountain on the island which is about 60 feet tall. It's not a geyser, it's not a natural feature. This is something that Lester designed, again, to reinforce the verticality of those pine trunks and create an effect that you can see from all around the garden. Something to draw you on, make you walk all the way. And here's a view of Pine Island, Point, the front lawn, Dumpling Knoll, from the hemlock woods. You see this wonderful lone hemlock there hanging out over one of the tremendous rock outcroppings here on the lake. This is the blue hour, just before dawn. Wang Wei wrote a poem called Drifting, which reminds me of Innisfree at this time of year. September skies are clear to the distance, clearer still so far from humankind. A heron by the pool, a mountain cloud, either of them makes the mind content. The faintest ripples still, and evening's here. The moon turns silver, and I dream, tonight leaning on a single oar, drifting without thought of going home. Well, I hope that all of this will entice you to come and drift around the lake at Innisfree without thought of going home. Thank you very much.
That was outstanding. And thank you to Lee for dropping everything that she had on her plate from Monday till tonight to pull that off by working with Kate. Well done. Thank you very much. That's one of the best PowerPoints I've seen. I've seen a lot of them, but boy, I'll tell you, that was just, well done. I can just say it. Okay, let's move on. Time for some inside stories about Innisfree. Seems about 9 years ago or so, when I was early on in my first presidency of the Historical Society, I was approached by the Taconic newspapers, specifically the editor of the Duchess magazine. And with the question, is the Historical Society interested in writing or publishing an article on Innisfree? Because they hadn't had an article that focused on it in some period of time. I said, yeah, why not? So let's do it. We did, and I was given my marching orders, no time limit, no specific word length. Very early on in the presentation, or in the research for the presentation, or for the article rather, and the article is a pretty nice one, including a lot of feature pictures and so on. A picture of Walter Beck, some of the pictures of the main great house that you saw in Lee's presentation here. And early on in the research, we discovered that there was a local personality living right here in the village of Millbrook. Her name was Edie McDonald, or I should say Edie Safari McDonald, Dave's spouse, living over on Safari Drive, and she had been raised at Innisfree. Interesting, I don't know anybody else in this community that was raised at Innisfree except Edie and her brother. Well, they were, and it was logical to approach them and say, would you give us some help? Would you give me some help, since I'm going to be the author of this whole thing? And she said, yes, absolutely. We spent hours and hours talking and researching the idea. We ended up with a tour of Innisfree, and we published the article, and it was apparently well received. Fast forward to June of this year. We'd already announced that tonight's program was going to be, quote, Innisfree, but there wasn't anything of a descriptive nature. Because frankly, I didn't know where we were going with this program 3 months ago. But 3 months ago at the annual tea, we started pulling our act together, and again it became obvious, we're going to do a program, Edie's got to be part of it. Went to her, and she said, yeah, I'd love to be with you. What's the date? I said, it's September 17th. She said, uh-oh, I can't be there. So I said, fine, very good. What can we do? So we banged our heads together and very shortly came up with the idea of another tour. But this time we would record it. And that's what we did. We used audio tape this time, not video, just audio. August 3rd, Edie McDonald, David Greenwood, Kate Kerin, who just narrated the PowerPoint, and I met in Innisfree, and we carried out about a 2-hour tour. It was recorded, it was scripted for tonight's presentation. Edie has seen and reviewed the script, so the comments that I'm giving to you tonight are from Edie via me with her approval and permission. We started our tour on August 3rd this summer. Beautiful day, if I remember correctly, David. At the Gatehouse. That's where Edie and her brother and mother and father lived. Edie's father was Gerald Chereau, who was the head gardener at Innisfree. As head gardener, Gerald, her father, had a staff of 14 men. This was in the early 50s. Edie was a youth. Father Gerald had worked at Innisfree since he was 15 years of age, having attended schooling at the New York Botanical Gardens. The Becks didn't fool around. If they were going to have somebody working on their gardens, they had to have the adequate training, and they made sure it was provided. In 1952, Gerald was promoted to site superintendent. Now, as we were talking about, Edie was ad-libbing, reminiscing, and I think there were some emotional moments for her recalling various things. She described Innisfree as a working estate with a vegetable garden, fruit gardens, chickens, pigs, even a large apple orchard at the very entrance, near the gatehouse. Now, there are a couple of apple trees left in the orchard, and she pointed out where that was. Innisfree had its own fire truck, if that's what you wanted to call it. It was a pickup. Why did they have a fire truck? Because they were a wooded area, with some grassy areas. It got dry. Oh yeah, the tinder got hot, and it could be subject to fire. So they developed their own fire. Well, it was a pickup truck with a water tank in the back with a pressure hose. They drive it around, if necessary, use it. That was a fire truck. Very interesting. Don't forget, they're about 3 miles from the Millbrook Fire Department. It would take them forever to get there.
It's covered by Pleasant Valley.
What's that?
It's covered by Pleasant Valley.
Covered by, oh, it is covered by Pleasant Valley.
Not
Thank
all
you, Skip, for
Pleasant
that
Valley.
clarification. Okay, so they do, even though, okay, you know what, that gives a good point. Half of Innisfree is in the town of Washington, half is in the town of Pleasant Valley. That's why they would have been covered by Pleasant Valley. Thank you, Skip. All right, flower arbors abounded, according to Edie. I have to read some of this stuff because this is scripted, okay? Mrs. Beck, interestingly enough, loved flowers, but she would not allow one flower to occur there, one type of flower. The answer is anything with the color red. For some reason, she had an aversion to the color red. I saw some, what I thought were red flowers here, certainly some lavender and others and white and so on and so forth. There may be red flowers today, but when Mrs. Beck was alive, there were no red flowers in Innisfree anywhere, even covering the 2 townships. Near the gatehouse was a root cellar where mushrooms were grown. There was a pigsty that supplied a lot of the meat consumed at Innisfree, a major portion of that meat. There was a chicken coop where Edie said, boy, I didn't like collecting eggs at all.
Get flooded out.
And then I had a flashback to when I used to have to collect eggs on a farm when I was a youth, and it's no fun crawling in a chicken coop. But she said there was also a greenhouse, a pond where exotic flowers such as orchids and birds of paradise were grown. Now, as Edie grew up, she became a young adult, and she graduated from high school. She got her first job. Where'd she get her first job? At IBM. And she said, I was the envy of every secretary down there because I was the only one who had birds of paradise on my desk every day. Not bad, not bad, not bad at all. She said on many afternoons in the 50s, when she was a youth, Edie relates that the Becks were taken from the great house, this humongous 45 rooms great house, gorgeous piece of work, and they were relayed or transferred to their favorite picnic site. Well, when they were picked up at the front entrance of the house, the great house, Mrs. Beck rode in the front seat of the pickup. Mr. Beck rode in the back. Why? He was in a wheelchair. Edie said, you know, for as long as I lived there, and this was the early 50s, so Mr. Beck would have been 80 or about 80 years of age and infirm by that time. She said, I never found out why Mr. Beck was in a wheelchair. Now, there's a gentleman in the audience tonight who surprised me with the new information. He said, I may have been one of the last people to know Otto Beck. Farnham Collins, would you like to comment?
I really can't, because I was only a child then, as Henry and other people here were. But I do remember them coming to the house, and I remember going to their house. I must have been this big. They were very kind to me as a child. So it was a happy memory.
Very good. Thank you for those comments. I know I blindsided you with the request to speak, but are you aware of what Mr. Beck's infirmity would have been, or David? Isn't the story? Okay, he was in a wheelchair the last few years of his life, that was for sure. Beck himself was born in 1864. The Civil War was still going on. He was in his 80s by the time Edie remembers a lot of these transfers. And what she said was that they were taken from the house, put in the truck, and where did they go? They went out the road, past the gatehouse, which meant that, although it's never been identified, the picnic site had to be off-site, because the gatehouse was the end of the property at that time. The gatehouse is now owned by the Rockefeller Institute. Jim may have some comments about that later on. But as they would pass the great house, they would stop. And she said Edie and her brother would be shepherded outside by the mother and father. And their Sunday best, say hello to Mrs. Beck. She said, simple as that little gesture of saying hello to the Becks was. She said, it's so vivid in my memory. She said it was very fascinating. Now, you've heard from David that the Becks came to Millbrook about 1920 after Marion Beck's father bought the property in about 1918, 1917, willing it to his daughter when he died in 1919. The great house was not finished until about 1930. In the meantime, the Becks had to live somewhere on site because they moved there about 1922 or 23 after they were married. And they lived in what was known as the cottage, where the Lester Collins family lived later on, after the Becks were no longer there. In Lester Collins' book, published just after his death in 1993, the Great House was, he said, the Great House was intended as a showcase for Walter Beck's painting and artwork. Beck was an accomplished artist. This is his book on Innisfree. I'm sorry, this is Lester Collins' book on Innisfree. But that's when he talks about Beck and all the paintings and so on and so forth. This book, I believe, is available through bookstore distribution through Merritt Books.
We are all out about 8 or 10 years ago. It was no longer being published. And Scott bought off all the rest of them.
If you had a sudden deluge of requests, could you get more, or would it be possible to put it on?
You know, that would be a great project.
Don't say yes or no. Excellent answer. We'll see where that goes. Okay. Edie recalls that on several occasions when she was a youth, playing outside the Great House, because she had access to the whole thing. And it's about a half a mile of walking between the gatehouse where Edie lived and the Beck's mansion. But the kids were all over Innisfree. They had free reign to do whatever they want. And she said when they were observed playing outside a house on a hot summer day, Mrs. Beck would frequently invite him into the Great House, take him into the living room, put him on the sofa, and feed them homemade ice cream. She said it was wonderful. She said, I sat on that couch, my legs didn't even reach the floor. She said, I was so good. The Great House itself had 45 rooms, many of which had fireplaces. I believe over 20 fireplaces in the house. 20 fireplaces for 45 rooms? That's pretty good. Mrs. Beck's bath. Now, why would we be talking about a bathroom, right? Mrs. Beck, but it was unique because he remembers specifically some things about the lodge, other than its greatness and its just beauty. Mrs. Beck's bath, it was all painted in lavender. Neat color. I love it. Mr. Beck's bath was painted entirely in black. Mr. Beck was 6'4" tall. He had the resource, he applied it, he had adjustments to all of his bathroom facilities to accommodate his height. Pretty neat. All right. Getting back to Edie's father, Gerald Chereau, who was superintendent of Innisfree. He was born in 1914, right at the beginning of the war in Europe. We were involved until 1917. He started working in Innisfree in 1929 as a laborer. He was promoted to superintendent in 1952 at age 38. Pretty young for a superintendent's job of a massive, major garden. But he had showed responsibility and accountability by that time and was promoted. Interestingly enough, Edie remembers that the Becks sent her father, Gerald, to what was known as growing school. Well, it obviously was a horticultural school or something in training in botanical skills or science and so on. But she knew it as growing school, and that's what she was told. When the Great House was built, about 1930, Mr. Beck decided to place in one corner of the building what we know now today as a time capsule. 1930. Chereau, his future superintendent, had joined the force only the year before. In the 30s and 40s, Gerald Chereau became aware, because Mr. Beck told him, that there was such a thing as the time capsule, and even what the contents were. 1980, as you heard in the presentation, the mansion was demolished. The time capsule was never found. Chereau and Beck had both died by that time. No one ever knows or will know what was in that time capsule, and someone comes out of the woodwork and tells us with some authority. But when Beck told Chereau about it, he swore to secrecy. That was interesting. He remembers that. Beck was an accomplished artist, as we said. He'd been trained at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, Germany as a youth. He had an extensive art profession here in the United States. He was an illustrator and a painter for many nationally known artistic magazines. And I don't think it was one that was geographic, but one of Beck's paintings once hung in the Smithsonian in Washington. That's how well-known and famous and recognized the gentleman was. Beck painted in several media, and I have my art teacher, Sarah Scott, sitting in the audience. We all know what pastels are. And Collins joins me in my art class every week, and we know what pastels are. We get trained in them on a regular basis. Pastels are not easy to work with, folks. They're a heck of a lot more difficult than pencil and pen, I'll tell you. But Beck was an accomplished pastel painter, oil painter, and others. And when tonight's presentation is done, we're going to invite you to leave this room, go through the corridor under escort. We're going to have 2 people take you in there, en masse. I know it's going to be a little bedlam. And you're going to see 3 pastels by Walter Beck. They are entitled The Last Supper, The Three Marys, and Christ for All Seasons. Those 3 paintings are from a series called The Life of Christ, all of which were conceived and drawn by Walter Beck. Must have been upwards of 20-25 paintings in the total series, but only those 3 do we know where the existence is today. They literally have been scattered. They're out there somewhere. But he had an incredible series, and it was thanks to the work of a former pastor at Lyell Memorial Federated Church, Carl Esmark, that the 3 paintings were negotiated and acquired for the church from the Lester Collins family. And say you're going to get to appreciate and enjoy them tonight. They're a treasure. They really are. Okay, fine. All we ask is don't touch them, but they're behind glass anyway, so you can't touch them. But let's go back to Innisfree here. Edie told us it was a totally self-sufficient estate. Now here you got the concept of the cut gardens and all the beautiful slides, beautiful pictures. But it was more than just a garden, a self-sufficient estate. There were natural blueberry patches throughout. There were associated black snakes with those blueberry patches that Edie remembers vividly. And she said, I even learned to drive on the roads in Innisfree. So she did spend her youth there, that's for sure. There was a small cottage on the lake called Little Italy, which I don't know where it is, and I haven't been able to find anybody who could tell me, where Walter Beck did a lot of his painting. It was sort of an escape from the house. It was an art studio. And we found out when you do things like pastels and oils, you need a separate facility, room, dedicated space where you can do that stuff, because it's messy and it also has a lot of odors. But it's very interesting. But he had a separate art studio to do these things. You're going to see many sites when you see them, but you saw them in the pictures, a series of lawn chairs. They may resemble in some aspect Adirondack chairs, but they are not Adirondack chairs. They were built, and that's the only thing that wasn't in the presentation. Who were they built by? They were built by Edie's uncle, a fellow named Ted Safari, who was a wood craftsperson in the village of Millbrook at the time. Those chairs, according to Kate Kerin, who worked with yes, I'm sorry. I apologize. I got a lapse of memory on that one. The chairs are originals. Did you know that? Apparently, those are the original chairs. They are now over 80 years of age. They're taken in and out during the wintertime and summertime for safety and security and so on. But apparently, those are the original chairs for 80 years of age. What lawn chairs do you know that survived that life? David talked about the fact that across the lake from the great house was the dance hall, known as the Lake Cottage. Right, David? Do I have that right? Okay, it was located not far from where the Lester Collins family lived. The Lake Cottage was a starting point for boating, dancing, parties, and other recreational activities, which made, and David used the word, destination. That's what Innisfree became in its existence. One of Edie's first jobs in Innisfree was deadheading flowers. If she was in the sun for any length of time and Mr. Beck saw her, he would go after Edie's father and say, I hope you don't let your daughter pick in the hot sun. Very benevolent character. Walter Beck was a very social, outgoing, gregarious person. His spouse is reportedly less so. But if she's the kind of person who would invite kids in on a hot summer day for homemade ice cream, she couldn't have been all that bad. Edie said about picking flowers, I hated it at the time. I didn't want to do that. As she said today, she really enjoys creating flower gardens at her home here in Millbrook. Edie's life with her brother in Innisfree, they loved the site, the huge rocks, trees, and slopes. They would tumble down the rocks. You saw the picture of the rocks with the 3 different rocks by name that you had in your presentation. Beautiful, beautiful picture. Edie says one of those rocks wasn't the name that she gave me. It was called Indian Rock because they played cowboy and Indians there. And they didn't know what the name of the rock was, that the Becks had put there, so they called it Indian Rock. Well, that's what kids do. Okay, those rocks were a marvel to all. The amazing thing, according to David Greenwood, was that the laborers who put their rocks into their settings throughout Innisfree, and there are tons of them, it must have been very, very labor intensive. David had researched this, and he found that, what were they paid? $175 a day's work for 10 to 12 hours? Not bad. After the Becks died, their ashes were scattered on the grounds in a place known only to those close to them. Edie knows where they are because the family of the Sherrods knew where they were. But it's one of those personal things, and the public in general probably will never know. She recalls that as the time she was growing up there, the grounds were more manicured than they are today. They were always in a more natural, I'm sorry, she said, my apologies, where the grounds were not quite as manicured as they are today. They were always in a more natural form and a natural beauty state. Quote, natural is the key word to describe Innisfree back then when the Becks owned it. And then Edie summed it up with one phrase. She said, it was a beautiful life there for my brother and me. A nice comment. Jim Cornett. Innisfree could be. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you and David very much because I've learned quite a bit tonight about the garden. I thought I knew quite a bit, but it's been very informative, and I'd like to thank my wife as well, who did a really remarkable job. I didn't know you could put voice with PowerPoint, and they sort of discovered that this week, and that's how that turned out as well as it did, so that was really nice of you've put all your time to that, and also it's nice to see so many friends here, so many people I've known in Millbrook for the 30 years that we've been living here. So that brings me to the point of how did I join the board at Innisfree, and I'm currently the only local community member that's a member of the board. It's a very small board, and I was asked to join the board about a year ago, and as you can see from these pictures that you saw tonight, this is a place that is very spiritual. I mean, you spend time, you walk around that garden. It's a special place, and that's why that garden was built there. People saw that, the Becks saw that, Lester Collins saw that. It just pulls people into it. It's so unique. I mean, there must be just the geology, the glacial lakes. It's very, very special. And so, and also the garden is, you know, it just gets by, as David made a very good point. Financially, a lot of people think that the garden has a lot of money, and it really doesn't. In fact, in the early 70s, it was pretty much saved by a gentleman who was heading up the Carey Institute at the time. He understood that that Innisfree was very short of funds. He arranged to raise money also for the Rockefeller University. He ended up raising money to where Innisfree sold 740 acres to Rockefeller University, and they were able to, they did that for $270,000, and that became the core of the foundation of their endowment, which right today is about $2.4 million. It's been very, very well managed, and it operates on a shoestring. The total operating budget is about $240,000 a year. It's mostly a labor of love for Kate Kerin and Oliver Collins. They get paid minimally. People who work there, there are quite a few volunteers, and obviously with an endowment of $2.4 million, the garden really can't survive. It's not sustainable unless you know, we increase that, and which is, I'll turn to that. But also, it's a very, very special place. In fact, as part of the process of raising money, we ended up commissioning one of the leading landscape authorities in the country, a gentleman named Charles Bierbaum,
who's the president and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and he recently spoke at the garden. Maybe some of you were there when he was there. And he concluded that Innisfree, and quote, that Innisfree is the most significant post-war landscape design in North America and perhaps the world. I think, we're sitting here in our little community. This is one of the most, very important cultural asset to the Millbrook community, and it's one that very few people are aware of. I don't know if you saw the Financial Times article that appeared on May 1st of this year, but the author Jane Owen wrote the following. About 90 miles north of the thrumming heart of New York City is a landscape named Innisfree that stirs my soul. I rate it along with Villa Lante, the Garden of Cosmic Speculation, Bliss Ard in Ireland, Little Sparta, Nina G. Temple in Cherry Blossom Season, and Cranbourne Manor Garden in Molly Salisbury's time. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert on landscapes. In fact, I wasn't familiar with any of those gardens, so I went and Googled all of them. They're all remarkable. These are some of the greatest landscapes in the world. And this person who came here and visited Innisfree, it was 15 years after she had visited the first time, she concluded that. So it's, as the Kate referenced, this is considered to be one of the great gardens in the world. I mean, not just one of the great gardens in New York State, or the great gardens in New England. This is one of the great gardens of the world. And so its preservation is really critical for a number of reasons. Innisfree hosts over 11,000 visitors per year. And that's why I think it is very important to sort of integrate that with what's in our community, because a lot of people go there, and then there's the people who could also spend more time within Millbrook. It's ranked #1 by TripAdvisor for things to do in Millbrook, and number 13 for things to do in the Hudson Valley. Which, when you think about West Point, Franklin Roosevelt's house, a number of great, Boscobel, that's pretty serious. So it's really well recognized and really underpublicized. Now, the board of Innisfree is focusing its attention on the following. Since, as I said, our current endowment is only $2.4 million, we need to increase this by another $5 to $7.5 million in order to make the garden sustainable. That's a big, big jump. So maybe that's why they asked me to join the board. But, so in order to get this going there, we have to undertake a cultural landscape report, and that's going to cost a great deal of more money, because what we're really hoping to get is National Historic Landmark designation. And that will give us the bona fides to be able to go out and raise money on a national level. Now, the Rockefeller University properties present an opportunity because they are currently in transition. And those properties basically surround the garden. If you look at Terrell Lake, there's two bodies of water. There's one where Innisfree is located, and there's one behind it. And the one that's behind it, just south of Terrell Lake, is owned primarily by Rockefeller, but also the hedge fund billionaire Bruce Kovner also owns a little piece, and a cottage that's located right on the lake there. So, and the reason we feel it's important to acquire the Rockefeller properties is sort of to bring them back to Innisfree. And that's, for us, is important, to reintegrate them with the existing property. And we need to protect our water and our view sheds, because our concern is that if someone put a house on one of the ridges overlooking the garden, it basically would destroy the garden. And we also have to protect our water quality, I think it's very important, and the control of Terrell Lake. We don't want that we don't want that to become like a recreational destination for people if they were to acquire the properties on the lake south of the property. Also, 2 of the parcels contain trails that were created by Lester Collins and meant to be part of the overall Innisfree concept, because there are 2 glacial ponds just north of the property where they left it very natural in a very original state, and he was really juxtaposing those with what you saw tonight. We also think it's important to prevent unrestricted development in the area. There are parcels parcel that's located along the Conic Parkway that has been acquired by the developer, who's trying to get the town of Pleasant Valley to run road, much more significant road, that would go past Innisfree and then connect out to the Taconic. There's also a piece of property just north of that, so you could see a great deal of development along the Taconic right there, similar to what you see down at the southern Taconic, right near the intersection with 84. That is a possibility there. We want to make sure we can prevent that. And most importantly, we want to preserve that beautiful gatehouse, and we want to reintegrate that to the property. And reestablish it as an entryway to the garden, create a visitor center there so we don't have the parking lot where it currently is, so we can actually move people out. It'd be a beautiful way. You really need to experience the garden by walking down that road and coming into the garden that way. And also we think it would be nice to set up like a Lester Collins library, a place where people could study landscape design and landscapes that have been influenced by Lester Collins. So as you can see, we have some very ambitious goals. A lot of those that might be pipe dreams, but then you have to think big in order to be able to preserve and save a place like Innisfree so future generations will be able to visit and enjoy those beautiful landscapes that you saw tonight. So with that, I would just like to say, if anybody have any questions, I'll try to answer them, but if not, I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Anybody have any questions for Jen?
Is the gatehouse as old as the main house was then?
Yes. And also, I understand, maybe David would know better. I understand it's a very significant architecture, right?
It's in remarkably good condition as well. There's a lot of information on a lot of stories, a lot of recollections of people who lived in it over the years, like Edie. And it really is surprisingly intact. And one of the joys that we had with Edie, as she went around pointing out the gardens, she also mentioned the various families who were responsible for those gardens. And just about every Italian family in our community has a connection with those gardens, or with the work, or maintaining it. And some of the people in the audience tonight have volunteered over the years to work in that garden. And the passion that the Becks had and Lester Collins had was picked up by a number of other estates in the area. And if we look to Mrs. Carey donated every year. She and her friends would get together and say, oh, you're $23,000 short, we'll make up the difference. And that happened for the several years, right up to 1993, when Collins dies, and they die, and suddenly that extra resource that was maintaining, it's all gone. But you look at the records now, it's extraordinary. One other thing about the house, when the Becks were there, they had 12 staff members in the house proper. So 12 people to maintain the house, and 20 full-time people on the lawns and property. And that's not the seasonal help that they also had. So imagine the staff to make that estate continue.
Yes.
Comment. A friend of mine, Ralph Shaw, worked at Innisfree for many years. He was a school teacher, but summers he worked there, and he took on a lot of responsibility. He had the keys to the place. To answer the question about the gatehouse, it's an exceptional shape, a Notabon. Fernando, right. He was in charge of that, and he's kept it up for a while. The house was demolished, and as you said, somebody said 80. Ralph Shaw one time called me up and said, we've got to go down and check things out. So we went down and checked the lake house out on the east shore of the lake, and then we went through the big house. And all I can tell you, as much as I'm interested in architecture, I was overwhelmed. And I had seen a few of mansions on Long Island and so forth and so on, but this was overwhelming. And you mentioned the bathrooms, we saw those. And Ralph took me on a run-up. We ran around the house. There were a lot of rooms that we couldn't examine, but he did what he had to do. the ironwork in there, the tile work in there, the artwork that was in there was phenomenal. I can't believe, I couldn't believe it at the time, but we made a very hasty trip. And he also took me up into the studio. And there, all I saw were racks upon racks, and the beautiful lighting, of course, and then racks upon racks of canvases, and the millions of brushes. It was just awe-inspiring, and but we had to make a very, very quick tour of it, and that's what disappointed me. But I'll tell you, it was amazing. The kind of the gatehouse was sort of reminiscent of the type of architecture that the house was, very stable and heavy and so forth. Well, yeah, thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Just a question, do you have any sort of membership categories for people to join Innisfree and get involved?
Yes, we have, we sent out, we'd love to get you on the mailing list. I should have thanked you for prompting that, but we do have, we send out, solicitations regularly, and we do host, we hosted an event not too long ago, and we have different categories within that, and I would be very, I don't have a place to sign up, but maybe it would be wonderful if you can go on the website, and or you can.
It's in the booklet too that they did even go.
Yeah, when you go
different
there.
categories.
Yeah. It's only $8 for admission, so.
Well, maybe I can help with that, but Charlie, you have a question?
Yeah, a real quick question. This Rockefeller Foundation seems like a big question mark to me. What do they do?
No, it's Rockefeller University.
Yeah,
And
but
Rockefeller
that's
University
what
is
it's
located.
called.
No, Rockefeller University is really a university. But it's only for PhD programs. It's located on the east side of Manhattan. They're undergoing a massive expansion plan. It's an incredible facility. We haven't been there. They just ended up setting up this research that Fernando Nottebohm has been overseeing as this project for maybe 30 years. And he's been doing research on bird songs, but really on brain functions. I mean, he's a leading expert on brain functions and really how. So Rockefeller University is a real university, but it only has graduate programs. So
and
it's
just jumping in, a word I've never heard before, ethology. How many of you know what ethology is? I didn't know it. Ethology is the study of animals in their natural habitat, and that's what they have devoted all the time to, looking at the animals in that environment. Those black snakes we were talking about, guess what? They've got doctorate dissertations on those snakes.
But it's at the Rockefeller Foundation.
There are a number of people who were at that institute in the 80s, I guess, who are now like head of the neuroscience, maybe at Johns Hopkins department, and they've really gone on to top levels.
Yeah, this is it's a world-class facility.
Well, I remember years ago, Terrell Road used to be open all the way to Hyde Park.
Right.
And then when Rockefeller, I guess, took over, they closed it off. So you
No,
can't-
Well, it's actually a very rough road. It still goes at the time. But you'd have to have a four-wheel drive. You'd have more than a four-wheel drive.
He's right. Mary and I did it about 10 years ago, didn't we?
Yeah.
But
You would actually, and it takes a four-wheel drive.
or even more than that. I mean, a Range Rover wouldn't even get stuck.
Take it over to New York Station.
Thank you. Yes.
What is the website?
Website, it's Innisfree.
Innisfreegarden.org.
Innisfreegarden.com.
.org.
I just have it on my, I don't have to even go that far, I just have the radius click. But anyway, thank you very much, and if there are any more questions, we can talk about it.
Thank you, Jim. What a nice positive thing. Now, we're not quite done quite yet. Hold on, please. Just one moment. Now is the time to Innisfree wants to thank you for your attendance tonight. What we have for you is a little gift from Innisfree in the unique form of tickets of free admission to the property. Just heard Jim say normal admission is $8. There are categories for 6, maybe even 4 if I remember correctly. But we have 80 tickets to give. That's what I said at the beginning of the presentation. I hope we have fewer than 80 people here tonight. You're all going to get a ticket. Now, here's how it's going to go. I've got 2 people on this side of the room. I've got Irene Wing and I've got Mickey Briscoe, each of whom have 20 tickets. On this side of the room, we got Diane McNeil and Bryce Ainsley, each of whom have 20 tickets. We don't know how this is going to be distributed. It's 1 ticket per person. We're going to ask you, don't ask for 5 or 6, please. If you're a spouse, husband and wife, ask for 2 tickets, please. If you're a family of 4, it's legitimate to ask for 4. But please don't ask for families, friends, relatives, or distant relatives, okay? Okay, very good. Go get them. And by the way, when that's done, we're going to ask you to go in with Bernadette. And who's working with you, Bernadette?
Linda and Allison.
Okay, Linda Colts and Bernadette will be leading you into the room where the Walter Beck paintings are.